Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser. And for today's episode, I've got a special guest with me and a special name for this episode. What happened to Rabbi? And if you're watching the episode and you see the person on your screen, you might remember him from his days promoting shows and going to shows in South Florida. I have on Rabbi. Welcome on to the podcast.
Hey, what's up, Jeff? How you doing, man?
I am doing
Good.
fantastic. Great to have you on. Uh,
Thank you.
you're
Thank
actually
you.
you're doing the episode in Miami, is that right?
I am. I was actually planning on doing this from the Cameo Theater, and the Cameo's closed. So my good friends over at Miami Ink let me post up at their shop. So a big shout out to Ami, to Jose, and to the great folks over here at Miami Ink. Love Hate, the tattoo shop right here on South Beach. So, I mean, they totally hooked me up. So really appreciate that.
Very cool. So when you
Yeah.
noticed the Cameo was closed, didn't look like it was the Cameo you knew growing up, how'd that make you
Yeah.
feel?
Well, you know what? It hasn't been the Cameo of my childhood for a long time, right? So, the Cameo played a special role in not only my life, but I think in most of the lives of my contemporaries who were raised in the scene. I believe the Cameo started doing shows in '85. It was right after Flynn's had closed down, Flynn's Ocean 71. And I started going to shows the summer of '86, which coincidentally was not at the Cameo. The Cameo was closed down that summer. But the Cameo was almost a character in our lives, because everything happened at the Cameo. The shows happened at the Cameo, the friendships that the people you met and the friendships that were developed that still carry on to this day. I mean, Ami's one of them, someone that I met at the Cameo and to this day, So there was something very unique about the Cameo and just the relationships that were forged at that place. It wasn't just a concert venue. It was one of those places where it was you would go and you would see all your friends. So much it's weird because you always think about high school and the different relationships you had in high school. Well, in the '80s, if you were punk rock, you really weren't part of your high school, because you listened to music they didn't listen to. You were into skating and, surfing and just a lot of things that just though they weren't into. They were into trying to fit in and just being cool, wearing the designer clothes and so forth. And we were not. We had the funny haircuts and the piercings and all that stuff. So the Cameo was that one place. It was like a refuge, someplace you can go and you could see all your friends, and it was friends from as far north as West Palm Beach to as far south as, the Keys. And like I said, these were people you would see all the time at shows, and it was just like I said, in a lot of ways, it was almost like its own character, the Cameo itself.
Yeah. There was a lot of
It,
stuff going on in Miami at that time too. A lot of drugs. Wasn't the safest place for a 16-year-old to hang out. So, did your
yeah.
parents know what you were up to at that age?
Oh, no way. It's my parents are cool, but and cool is relative, right? So my mom really liked music, so she was like into like Herb Albert and Tijuana Brass and so much stuff. Now I look back and like, oh yeah, my mom was into like all this. Like back then, it was like you just said, "Mom, not listening to that." You get older, you're like, man, it's almost like you discovered for yourself. And a lot of the music we did discover for ourselves. But you know what? I was raised on Kiss and Alice Cooper, and I'm talking about like 7, 8 years old. Started listening to that stuff. And I think that's kind of where it starts, right? It was the makeup, it was the appeal. And then from there, you evolve into Led Zeppelin and the Doors and Jimi Hendrix and the Who, all the, dinosaur rock or like the '60s stuff. And eventually you start getting into skating. And then next thing you know, it's the Circle Jerks and 7 Seconds and the Meat Man and Suicidal and Black Flag. Um, so growing up watching some of the older guys in the neighborhood going to see Black Flag with Painted Willie and Gone. And they're like, come on, come with us. They were taking the bus. And I was 15 years old, I probably I had a hint of the tism, I just was not ready for this. So, but skating, the funny haircuts, I had a mohawk at the time. And come that June, I had turned 16 and I went to my first show. It was Charged GBH with Agnostic Front. It was the Brotherhood tour. And it was at the Lincoln Theater, which is right down the street from the Cameo. It's like right on Lincoln Road. And the Cameo is closed that summer for renovations. So um, Hell Witch was the opening band. And you could sit in the front row and kick your feet up on the stage. By the time Agnostic Front got through their first song, the first 3 rows of seats were tore out. And it was stage diving, slam dancing. It was just absolutely wild. And I think one of the things that struck me the most about that was how big the scene was. It's one of the first times I actually really ventured out of my neighborhood. And you grow up with your friends, and there's like maybe 10, 12, 15 of you as part of the crew, right? You're skating, you're listening to music, you got the local ramp, and suddenly you go there and there's hundreds of people that are also into the same music, into the same culture, and you almost have this spiritual kinship with them. It's funny, I've met 2 people in my life that I never grew up with. One grew up, where did Doug grow up? Oh, he was in Boston. He was a Boston kid, lived out in LA. And then my friend Susie, she grew up in Cleveland. And we all knew the same people around the country. So I might as well have grown up with these people because you become fast friends with them. You meet them and suddenly but they also grew up in the same era. And I don't know if it's a generational thing for sure. It was a generational thing for sure because I see kids now. Like I went to go see Gorilla Biscuits and it was great. I got to be 17 again for a little bit, but you didn't feel the same level of fear that you did going to the Cameo or even like my first shows where you had skinheads, you know, you had a lot of violence. South Florida is very, very was known very much for their violence. And that was all throughout the 80s and into the 90s. It was a lot of violence. I've seen friends get stabbed. I've had friends shot right in front of me. And I don't know if it was just because South Florida at that time, this was during the cocaine cowboy days. And it was Scarface. Scarface was filmed here on South Beach. And that's what South Beach was. It wasn't what South Beach is today. It was dark, it was scary, it was dangerous, it was fun, it was crazy. It's because in the Cameo was out here on South Beach. So that was what drew us to this place. You know what I mean? It was everything that drew us. Because if the Cameo wasn't on South Beach, we would never have come to South Beach. But because the Cameo is here, it's what drew us all here. Now, I mentioned earlier about the Lincoln Theater. Saw my first 3 shows there, and it was the first show, GBH with Agnostic Front. The next show I saw was Descendants. And, well, it was Die Kreutzen. Die Kreutzen was the headlining band, but it was Die Kreutzen, Descendants, and Dag Nasty. Now, this is Dag Nasty 1986, okay? This is Descendants 1986, and they would come down quite often. I think Milo had just gotten back from college. Because remember the first album, Milo goes to college. He goes
Right.
to college, he comes back, and now they get the band back together and they're touring extensively. So, um, in Die Kreutzen, you know what? Dag Nasty was amazing. If I'm not mistaken, Dave Smalley was singing, but I might have some doubts about that. But sometimes your memories lie to you. But I know it was "Can I Say," right? So And then Descendants is the first time I ever saw Descendants, and once again, mind blown. But Die Kreuzen comes on, they're like, and everyone's yelling at them to play faster. They're kind of slow, sluggish, and they're like, "We'll play how we want to play." And like 800 kids walked out of their concert, like two songs in, everyone just left. And it was great. Like right behind the Lincoln Theater was the parking garage, and across from that was the City Hall. And City Hall had this fountain, and it was all concave, so you could skate it. So there was like a few hundred of us skating, like City Hall. Like it was a lot of fun. It was really cool, cool scene, cool memories. And then that was July, and then August, MDC came through, and MDC, that they were just so awesome. I mean, I can't even describe it, but they
Did you know who was bringing these bands down to South Florida at that time?
at the time it was Richard Shelter. Um, I know Bob Slade also did a lot of stuff around that time as well. So I would say it was just between those two. They were really the main promoters here at this time. And both of them I have so much respect for. And I know at some point we're going to talk about if I could do something over, you know, um, what would it be? And it was something that both Bob Slade and Richard Shelter did is they did a lot of scene building. If it wasn't for Richard Shelter, there'd be no scene down here. There would have been, listen, you know where Miami is in regards to the rest of the country. You're 4.5 hours away from Tampa, 4 hours away from Orlando. For a band to have to come all the way down here to play and then leave, it wasn't going to happen unless you had Richard Shelter and Bob Slade. Bob Slade did a great job building the scene down here. He had a zine, Tropical Depression. He had Off the Beaten Path, his radio show on WLRN. And I remember during that time specifically, just being up. It was I believe it was Monday nights at 12 to 2, just being up, a school night, right? Just listen to the radio, under the covers, and he would play like I'm pretty sure he brought the Descendants Dag Nasty show down because he was playing Can I Say in rotation. I think the Descendants Enjoy had just come out, so it was playing Enjoy,
Right.
like just in rotation. So when you got to the show, you already knew all the songs and everything. Um,
Were
so
there
it was
any
really those. Yes, I'm sorry.
were there any Florida bands you discovered from Bob Slade show?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, it's generational, right? So at that time, the big bands were Amazing Grace and the Drills. Those were like the two big bands down here. You know, it's generational, and it's also very reflective of the stuff that's happening because regions are usually influenced by exposure. So the bands that would come through would influence the bands. I could be absolutely honest with you. I've seen Amazing Grace and the Drills many times. In fact, that Dag Nasty Descendants, like Kreutzen, the Drills opened up. Um, but I couldn't really tell you a whole lot about either of those bands. You had Silent Rage, that was another band, and those are South Florida bands. You also had Disorderly Conduct up up the coast. I believe they were north of Jupiter. Were they
Melbourne.
Daytona? Melbourne. You had Sugar. You had so many great bands. I don't know if you ever heard The Chosen before. The Chosen, they were from Palm Beach or possibly Jupiter. Amazing, amazing band. But that's what happened. A lot of those bands never really got beyond, just that local status. And playing the Cameo was every local band's dream, right? So there were bands that came up that became part of my generation, including Quit, Load, and Powerhouse, and Beyond Reason, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. The Believers, and they were all friends of ours. So eventually, as the scene evolved, bands like Amazing Grace and the Drills kind of faded out. And then you had all the backyard parties with bands like Fwa and well, Rugged Edge was part of that. Rugged Edge was more of a Fort Lauderdale skinhead band, you know. But once again, we were all friends. It was all like one giant scene. It was, I spent just as much time in Fort Lauderdale and Coral Springs as I did in Kendall and in Homestead with with all these shows and so forth. So, or in just catching different bands and so forth. And to me, it's the local bands were the kids that really built the scene, right? Because especially if they were still in high school, all the kids that would come out to see them. And that really helped me when I started doing shows, because I would usually use the bands that came out and supported. They were basically the kids that came to the shows. Those were the bands that would hook up when, um, like, as opening bands for the shows. So it really worked out well. Getting back to MDC, that show, they were catching a flight to San Francisco and they were really running late. They were late to the show. So Dave played an acoustic set while the band just packed up. I think they did a 15, 20-minute electric set, like full, and then Dave just kind of closed it out with an acoustic set for another 20, 30 minutes. And it was great. It was great. It was the first album, it was really cool. And then after that, that's when I finally got to go to the Cameo. Um, Not sure which show was first, but it was either Bad Brains and Doctor No or 7 Seconds with Verbal Assaults. Four absolutely amazing bands, two incredible shows. That's the first time I ever saw Bad Brains. And I remember sitting in the balcony. The Cameo had a balcony, and just sitting in the balcony watching the Bad Brains get high. And they're Rastas. I mean, this is the Bad Brains in '86.
Right.
Okay, all these bands. This was Verbal Assault blew me away. On towards 7 Seconds, and 7 Seconds, that's one of the bands I've been into for like almost the longest. And man, like, this is Walk Together, Rock Together. This is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just so, like I said, I got to see both these bands a number of times after, but something about the first time, right? The
Right.
Bad Brains would come down again. That was probably September. The Bad Brains would come down again in February.
Was that first
And
time you saw them with, did the drills open up?
you know what? I don't remember. I don't remember who opened up. I remember Doctor No because I love Doctor No, you know, and that was really great. And but the next time they came through Toxic Reasons, and it was February, and they went from this is Eye Against Eye had come out. So I think Eye Against Eye just came out when I saw them the first time. The second time they came through, there was probably 1,500 people at the Cameo, and it was just absolute mayhem. But once again, this is the Bad Brains, really, in my opinion, at the very pinnacle of who they are, of who they were. They're probably the biggest band at that time, definitely in punk rock, and punk rock hardcore scene. But they were starting to get a lot of mainstream,
Sure.
attention at this point. And to me, I think '87 was the best year of, of the Cameo as far as like that iconic year. I mentioned earlier about, the Dead Kennedys, and then Circle Jerks with Descendants, and Suicidal and Black Flag, all within six weeks of each other. But in you had in '87, you had the Bad Brains for Toxic Reasons. You had Government Issue with Beyond Possession. Wow, that was so awesome. Skate punk band, right? Um, that summer, you had Descendants come through, and they brought with them the Henry Rollins band. Okay, and this is I never had a chance to see Black Flag, but once again, one of my favorite bands. and it was the Rollins band touring on the first album, Odd Animal Machine. So it's Rollins still angry, still like in the thick of it, right? Just finished with Black Flag, still angry. It was just great. And that's the Rollins band with Sim Kane and Andrew Weiss. I think they played with Greg Ginn and Gone. So the last tour, he took some of the players in the opening band and then created them along with Chris Haskett. Uh, you had one of my favorite shows of all time. It's 7 Seconds with Dag Nasty and Youth of Today. And this is the first time Youth of Today came through. And no one knew who they were. Okay. Evan Umbar, he knew who they were. Okay. Because he knew the New York scene and everything. And he was telling everyone, hey, you need to go check these guys out. And it was Ray and Porcel. I believe Richie from Underdog was playing bass. Walter possibly could have also been playing second guitar on that. And Mike Judge was playing drums. Don't quote me on this, but I know there were a five-piece, and I know that would have been the five-piece that came through at that time. It was the Can't Close My Eyes EP. They were selling it out of the van. They got added to the bill. Justice League was supposed to open. Justice League canceled out, and it was Youth of Today. They end up getting stuck down here. Their van breaks down. They're staying with the Bad Rep Skins up in Fort Lauderdale, and they end up playing skate night up in West Palm Beach. And it was in Lake Worth. It was a skating rink that they did a skate night there, and suddenly Youth of Today is playing there.
Were there other Florida
So
bands playing that too?
not
Maybe.
that show. I think it was Youth Today. I'm not sure, but the Believers were up there and we were hanging out with them. This is really where you kind of started to see the scene turn away from bands like Amazing Grace and the Drills, and now it started turning more towards bands like Flaw, um, Powerhouse. Beyond Reason was still a couple of years out, um, but Quit and Powerhouse were probably the two big bands down here at that time, local bands.
Were you seeing these
Uh,
bands? Were you trying to see some of those bands play
of
too a lot at that time?
course, absolutely. They were friends of ours. I mean, Addie, I lived in a six-bedroom house in downtown Miami. Bands would come through, they'd stay there. Green Day stayed at that house one tour, and Addison lived there. So, like I said, it was great. Like Brian Elliott from Timescape Zero, he lived there as well. So I could always tell who was at home by who was playing guitar. Okay. Addison was playing more of the melodic power pop stuff, Jawbreaker, Green Day, and Brian was playing more of the chunky metal, you know. So, um, but they were friends of ours. I grew up with Tim and Ivan, very, very close friends with those guys. Even on the demo, a friend I went to elementary school, Mario Colangelo, he played with them, and like I said, it was just friends and just seeing them play, and you know that was the result of Youth of Today. The Youth Today brought straight edge down here, and it was the ideology, of course, but more the fashion, the floor punch, the different styles of dance was introduced to South Florida, and all of that came from that 7 second show. I think, to me, you saw a shift in the scene from punk rock into more of the hardcore stuff. Bands like the Cro-Mags. The Cro-Mags came down in '87, but it was Harley's Cro-Mags. This is after John Joseph had left the band. Um, shoot, it just so much of the scene changed from that point
Right.
on suddenly, and it was a cultural change too, because you had the Believers demo had come out a little bit after that. The Powerhouse demo came out after that, and everyone was into writing letters to people around the country. So I know Ray from You Today, Ray Capo, he had correspondence. Walter had correspondence with people. It was a lot of tape exchanges and Revelation Records, and the Sick of It All 7-inch had just come out, and the Gorilla Biscuits 7-inch, and this and all the record collecting really started down here in the scene. Whereas before, and not to take anything away from the David Bowie and the Iggy Pop and the punk rock of the scene, but hardcore started really taking off from there. And I know hardcore New York, the Chromex probably go into 85, 84. A lot of that sound had already started, but now, and you can listen to the Misfits. Misfits are hardcore for sure. But you listen to Earth AD, where it's almost metal, right? And I think that's 83. So SSD had already moved into more of a metal direction, and you kind of saw just the music just got a lot heavier and a lot harder, especially stuff coming out of the Northeast, both New York and Boston, Slapshot, and once again, the whole straight edge thing, with the whole New York Youth Crew,
Yeah,
all the Boston bands, because Minor Threat was long gone at this point.
sure.
And if my hardcore history doesn't fail me, you didn't really have a straight edge movement after Minor Threat in the DC area. Yeah, you had bands like Soulside and Beefeater and Rites of Spring and amazing bands, all of them, but no one really, and whether they were straight edge or vegan or vegetarian, and they kept the ethos. I spoke English. Um,
What did you think of that though when that landed in South Florida? What was your opinion of that at that time as it landed where you grew up?
like straight edge.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, like I was I was smoking weed a lot. I was smoking weed a lot back then, like daily at this point. Um, and it was regardless of that, because as far as I know, 7 Seconds, those guys were straight, right? Minor Threat, like we listened to the music regardless of whether we believed it or followed the tenets of it. And I'm not going to call anyone out, but I like I said, I was really good friends with a lot of these bands, right? Even the straight edge ones. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Fair enough. So,
So, but
you're
wait.
yeah,
Let me get back to this.
yeah.
I think that something that all the New York sound, I think what it was a distinctive sound. It separated itself from the Boston sound, from the DC sound, from the LA sound, from the West Coast. Like lots of times you could listen to bands and okay, I know where they're from by their sound and so forth. Because once again, it's a scene, it influences each other, right? New York, Sammy played with all these bands, Sammy Sigler. He played with all these bands. So it's like, okay, so how do you get away, change your sound? Walter played with a bunch of these bands, right? Gorilla Biscuits, so, um, but it was this energy and something unique about music. It's the way it resonates with you, right? The way it hits you. And so many of these bands we probably saw before we ever listened to them on vinyl, you know, because you had off the beaten path, right? But outside of that, and remember, it's Monday nights from 12 to 2. You didn't always catch all those. And it wasn't like Bob wasn't really pushing anything that he didn't like or that he wasn't into. So, and I don't know how he felt about the whole New York hardcore scene or what have you. I don't know if he was really into that music just in general, but so many of us trading tapes, the record collecting, the 7 inches. And so the music hits you in a certain way, it hits your heart in a certain way, and it resonates with you. So, but for me, most of the time it was you see them live, and now it's like, okay, now these bands become almost a part of your life. And one of the things that really struck me about these bands were they were all our age. They were just like, like when Sammy was touring the country, he couldn't have been 17 years old, right? 16, 17 years old. First time he's out on the road. And I was 16, 17 years old the first time I was 17, first time they came through,
Yeah.
you know?
Were you ever
So
compelled because you're seeing all these people come down, you're seeing all these shows? Like, did you play anything at that time? Were you ever compelled to pick up an instrument and play yourself at that point?
thankfully, I can play music for the deaf, right? Okay.
So
Um,
that would be a no then.
no, you know what? It was one of those things where I would have loved to have, and I think that I don't know, it's something some people just do it and some people don't. I have no problem speaking publicly now, and I find it somewhat romantic to be able to go back and because when you play in a band and you tour, you create certain memories, right? So you have a lot of different experiences. Like I did shows and I've got to go on the road with bands and I've got to see other bands around the country because I did shows down here. It became something that I really enjoyed doing. Um, I don't know if it's a regret or not because I guess it would have been cool if I would have done it, but since I didn't, then it's not something I can really go, like look back. It's not like I don't have regrets that I didn't do it. Um, and I've got a lot of thoughts too on some of the folks that did do it, because you have a very small window, right? You have a very small window to take it from this level to this level, to go from a local band to a national band to a our bills are paid band, you know? And a lot of people don't ever get that far, professional musician. I think Addison from Quit became a professional musician. Juan Montoya was actually at one point doing this on a professional level. Jason Letterman, he did this on a professional level. I think probably the most successful band to ever come out of the area was Cynic, technical death metal band that went on to become prog metal, and probably good friends, number one, and just just amazing people and just amazing musicians, like legit amazing musicians. And I think that that's somewhat more the exceptions than the rules. I'm sure there's a few others
Sure.
that became, you know, but I mean, I'm um, like a band like The Chosen. I believe they were from Jupiter. They were a great band. They really never made it beyond opening up for national acts on a local level. You take a band like Radon out of Gainesville. I don't know if you've ever listened to them, but they are absolutely amazing. The song structure, the ear candy. Like, how could you not like a band like Radon, right? And so,
Did you ever see Chocolate Grasshopper that predated Radon back in
oh,
the day?
of course, yeah.
What are your memories of seeing them?
I saw them at the Cameo of all places, but and there was another band out of Gainesville called the Doldrums. That was another really, really solid band. I got to see them at the Cameo. They opened up for DI and Doggy Style, and I thought they were so much better than Doggy Style, but that's just personal.
Were you
And I
only
think
seeing
that
these bands when they came down south, or did you ever find yourself going up and traveling a bit throughout the state?
I did. But I think that was a little bit later on. I missed the Damned at the Cameo because it's funny. I was at the show and Foix was on their way to Melbourne to open up for 7 Seconds. So I just hopped up in the van with them. And I kind of regretted it because it was the final tour of the Damned. Not really, right? I think that was like 88. But I think the Gender Torturers opened up. So I've seen the Gender Torturers in Orlando, Adventures in Immortality in Orlando. Bloodlet. I've seen Bloodlet play a house in Gainesville, and Bloodlet, they're definitely top 10 of my favorite Florida bands
What
for
was that show?
sure.
What was that show like? Seeing them in Gainesville?
Oh, it was a house party. It was great. It was a lot of fun. It's like I said, I've seen a lot of cool things around the country. Like I'm sorry, around the state. I've seen Awake. I brought Awake down. I knew those guys really well. I saw them up in Tampa. Um, I saw the People's Court, another Tampa band play. I think did they become, no, it was Don who played in Awake, did not play in Don's ex-girlfriend, but the band was named after him. And they were a really cool band out of Gainesville. Gainesville was one of those places like, and I think it really hurt a lot of the local bands because some kids would go to school in Gainesville, right? So you'd break up the band here and you'd start a new band up there. And obviously you had Hot Water Music and Less Than Jake, two very strong, well-known, well-toured bands. Um, Addison eventually moved to Gainesville. I think that's what it was. It's like a lot of local bands. It's like Russell moved away, so he left, quit. He moved away. Cynic, after high school, they committed themselves to the band, and you had Paul and Sean, who were just like I said, just amazing musicians, and they were able to really just create a living out of this. And they actually did the Death. They did the Death tour, and then Chuck from Death asked them to do the Human album. And if you ever have a chance to listen to that, that's well worth a listen. Actually, you can find it on YouTube. There is a recording of just the bass and the drums from the Death Human album. And if you ever had any doubts, listen to that album, and it'll erase all doubts about who Sean Reinhart was and what he could do. Like, God rest his soul, and sorry that he passed. He's one of my. I listen. He's that dude. I could just listen to Sean just play drums, and I would just be happy. I mean, he's just so interesting, and I mean, I've spent so many days or so many evenings at their warehouse listening to those dudes play, and it was just, to me, it was just one of those things that you took for granted, because when you're 17, you're 18, you think you're going to be 17, 18 forever, right? And you don't understand. I really wish we knew that those days were just fleeting. Another thing that happened in 87 was Metal Nights at the Cameo. It was on Thursday nights, and they bring down bands like At War, Rigor Mortis, and just like all these like metal bands like Death and Morbid Angel. And we would go, like a handful of us, and we would sneak in. We knew security, so I don't even think it was like even considered sneaking in. So we would go and we catch all these metal acts, and that's when I first saw Cynic. And I thought Cynic was a national act by their sound, by the way they conducted themselves, just everything about them was just like, wow. So Metal Nights at the Cameo. And there'd be like 15, listen, honestly, there'd be 50 people to see Death play. So it was almost like a private show of these just amazing bands. And, as a kid, we didn't just listen to hardcore. We didn't just listen to punk rock. We listened to Slayer. We listened to the Smiths. We listened to The Cure. We listened to Public Enemy. We listened to Boogie Down Productions. To me, it was all underground music. So we were so diverse in our tastes, and it really opened up so many avenues for me on a personal level. Because to me, to be honest with you, I really don't listen to music anymore. I find that for me, music has to be really interesting. There has to be a level of dynamics to it. I mean, I love The Refuse, The Shape of Punk to Come. I think that's a masterpiece. I probably still listen to Avail because I really like Avail a lot. But, you know, my personal feeling is like The Refuse should have died and kept it dead. They should have just like, all right, let's put this down and let's move on. I don't think we're gonna ever do anything better than this. But the dynamics of it, the movement of the music, um,
Do you
yeah,
th- do you,
I'm sorry. What were you gonna say?
do you think that a lot of the diversity of music that you were getting into, right? The hardcore, the punk, the metal, the more indie college rock kind of stuff, the hip hop, how much of that do you think went into your wanting to promote shows down in South Florida?
Well, you know, like I said, I grew up in the scene down here, okay? And the Cameo eventually stopped doing shows. I understand it more now than I did then because I was just a fool in the crowd, right? But the last few shows I saw, and I was fortunate, I got to bring Fugazi down to the Cameo, okay? But the last few shows I saw there were
How'd you get that
uh
done?
I'll get to that. I'll
Okay.
get to that in just
All
a
right.
minute. But I saw the Sugar Cubes there, right, with Bjork. I saw Dave Byrne from Talking Heads do a concert there with a Brazilian orchestra. Saw the Beastie Boys at the Cameo, and Fushnikins and Big Chief, which was Barry from the Necros. They opened up. Um, the Beastie Boys always, Beastie Boys were boys. They were when I say boys, they came from the hardcore scene from New York. After their Run DMC Houdini tour, after their opening up for Madonna tour, they came through as a headlining act and they brought Murphy's Law and Fishbone, two of our friends, right? You know, Back to 87, I saw the first time I saw Red Hot Chili Peppers and Murphy's Law was together, or I'm sorry, it was Red Hot Chili Peppers and Faith No More in 87. Early 88, it was Faith No More and Murphy's Law. No, I'm sorry. It was Red Hot Chili Peppers and Murphy's Law. Um, I'm sorry, I'm all over the place because it all starts coming to me. But so we get to 1990. And at this point, the Cameo is a done deal. Some friends of ours opened up a club on Alton Road called the Thrashcan. And they were more into metal than hardcore. It was Barry, it was Danny, it was Bobby Radical. And they wanted to bring down different acts and so forth. So they were going to bring down Gorilla Biscuits. And Gorilla Biscuits canceled, right? So at this time, I was starting to dip my foot in the water and I wanted to actually start a record label. So the very first show I did was a local show, and it was Powerhouse Beyond no, I'm sorry, it was Powerhouse, Flaw, Quit, Cynic, and the Believers. And the record label never happened, but we did that show, and it was tremendous. It was a huge turnout. It was all local bands, right? There was nothing really I did, but the owners of the club approached me and was like saying, "Hey, would you like to book concerts here?" And I didn't really know anything about booking concerts, and I didn't really have enough sense to say no. So the very first show I did was I reached out to Walter from Gorilla Biscuits because I was like, "Hey, listen, I know you guys canceled. You guys want to come back down and reschedule?" Well, he's like, "Well, they broke up, but can my other band come down, Quicksand?" And I think the 7-inch had just come out, and I was like, "Yeah, yeah, let's do that." So um, it was Quicksand, this band Bazooka Joe from South Carolina who just happened to be passing through. They were more punk rock. Awake was on that bill, and I think Beyond Reason. Jason Letterman, Brian Elliott from Timescape. It was their band that opened up, and it was great. I think Walter wasn't even playing guitar; he was singing. He was just singing. That was I think Charlie from Gorilla Biscuits was playing second guitar or second guitar. That's you had Tom Capone. You had Alan Cage, which also played in Burn. and Porcell came through. He was hanging out with those guys. It was the New York crew. So
How important
that,
was it for you to make sure you had Florida bands opening up for some of these bands that were you bringing in from out of town?
oh, 100%. Because, like I said, these are friends of mine, you know, and I always believed, and I guess, I don't know if we talked about scene building, you know, and I mentioned both Richard Shelter and Bob Slade did a great job of scene building. And I think that my part of my scene building was including local bands on all the shows I did because I understood the draw of the local bands. And once again, it was also my way to give back to my friends because for them, most of them never had a chance to play the cameo. Okay. And for now, the scene has always been generational. Okay. Like when I got into the scene in 86, there was an older generation that had been there in 85 and another generation that had been there since 84. And then, you know, eventually 87 would be my first show, and my first show in 1989, and now my first show in 1990. I talked to a friend of mine. He said his first show was Sam I Am. And I saw him at Gorilla Biscuits. He's like, man, I'll never forget you or thank you enough for bringing down Sam I Am. They were my favorite band. That was my first show. And that made me feel really good because to me, I remember how it felt my first show. And here it was me bringing down a lot of these bands, and it became their first show. So I started doing shows in 1990 at the Thrashcan. I think that show was the local show was August. Quicksand came down in September, and then there was this guy Fat Harry out of Orlando. And what Fat Harry would do was he knew booking agents around the country, and they would contact him, and he would book dates with different venues around the state. Jim Hayward was one of them. Jim Hayward was up in the Palm Beach territory. And myself, I was down here in Miami. He started working with me doing shows, and he was skimming off the top. Okay. So basically, if a band wanted $500, he'd sell it to me for 800. You know, so looking back now, I see how unethical that was, right? Because I didn't know any better. You know, when I talked to Walter the first time before I brought Quicksand down, he was like, "Hey, are you able to get us other dates in Florida? Because I can't come down, you know, New York to Miami and then back to New York." So I reached out to this kid Richie, who lived in Tampa. He was with the Awake Boys. He knew all those guys. So we hooked up, and he was doing shows out there. And then there was John White. John White, I love John White. He was up in Melbourne. He was from Washington State. He did a radio show in Melbourne. I love John White. John White. Do you know John? Did you ever meet John?
I have never met John, but I have heard his name brought up before from other people on the podcast.
He is such a salt of the earth dude. Such a solid dude. And you know, so many times like we created a really good connection where, like I said, every time a band would come through, we would do that circuit right there, you know. And it made sense, right? Melbourne, Miami, Tampa, or Tampa, Miami, Melbourne, because you had to kind of keep it going, right? So, um, yeah, I'm sorry, I just thought of a bunch of great memories with John. You know, I remember one time going up to hang out with John, and then it was Jawbox, and something happened. I was supposed to bring Jawbox down, and it just canceled, and I just really had no control over it. It's maybe that's kind of where the drugs came in, and the drugs really were a problem. I didn't know it then as much as I know it now. I've been sober since '96. Okay, I'm talking about no drinking, no smoking. I don't even cuss. And you know, they ended up playing Melbourne with Corrosion of Conformity, and I heard Kim from Jawbox talking about the stoner in Miami who messed up their show. And she didn't realize I was there because I was that stoner in Miami that messed up their show. So I guess I could have made it work, but whatever. But I remember going with John to go see Helmet and Jawbox in Orlando, and they played a pizza shop. Okay. And this is how ignorant I was to Helmet. I had never heard Helmet before. They look like a bunch of college kids. They're just tuning up their instruments and everything. I had just smoked, okay? So I'm high, and they just tear into their set. And I was just floored. And there couldn't have been more than 25, 30 people at the show, okay? Once again, that was the magic of hardcore as a kid coming up. You got to see so many great bands play small venues. I mean,
Sure.
I've seen Jane's Addiction open up for Love and Rockets. I've seen Jane's Addiction play a club here called Woody's on Ocean Drive. I've seen Jane's Addiction. I didn't see Jane's Addiction open up. I did not see them open up for Iggy Pop, but Harry got me into the show for free. It's a long story at the Cameo. So
Very
I got
lucky
some.
that you got to go to
Yeah,
that one. Did you at all know Jim Faraday, who was also promoting shows up in Central Florida?
you know what? I've never met him, but I've heard his name. I've heard his name a number of times. You know, but you know what? It's a circuit, right? It's a circuit. It's you just make connections. The Tampa connection fell away when Richie went to college. So suddenly it's kind of like a little void there. John eventually moved back to Washington State. Like he did a radio show. Look, John would be a great interview for you if you ever have a chance to get him on the podcast for real. Um, but my first 6 months of doing shows brought down Agnostic Front. This is when Roger just got out of prison. You know, um, they were a different type of New York hardcore than the youth crew. They're all friends, but the crowd they drew, like Agnostic Front, Biohazard, the Cro-Mags, they bring more of the skinheads. Whereas Youth Today, Gorilla Biscuits, Bold, Quicksand, Burn, they brought more of the hardcore kids. So just a little bit different. And the crowds were different because, like I said earlier, the Cameo is very violent. Lots of fights. I remember seeing Blast at the Cameo and they couldn't get through a single song without a major fight breaking out. I remember the Vandals coming through and playing the Cameo, and a bunch of white power skinheads came down from Central Florida somewhere, and they had the swastikas and just but they had it covered up until they didn't, and then once they didn't, it was on, you know. So the fight started in the lobby of the Cameo, went down the aisle, and then across the dance floor and right out the side door. Okay, it was just brutal. So yeah, let me show you. I'll share with you this really quick. Like I was privileged to see SNFU, and one of my favorite bands. I had a chance to see them with The Accused the first time they came through, and then the next time they came through. No, 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 that was the second time. The first time, I don't remember who the opening band was, but The Accused were amazing, and I got to bring them down, so I'm really happy about that. And I'll get into that. I'll get. I got so much I gotta get into, but some friends of ours. I mentioned trading tapes and all the letters across the country and so forth. Tim Price was very good friends. Tim was really good at this. Tim from Powerhouse, he was really, really good at just writing letters. And, you know, uh, one of his first girlfriends was this girl, Julie. She was from Washington State. And all the kids from Washington State, Undertow, Mean Season, all those bands. Oh, Mean Season was from California. But just we created this friendship, right? So Brotherhood comes down, okay? And Brotherhood gets hooked up on this tour with SNFU and the Accused, okay? I love the Accused, Kings of the West Coast, and SNFU, and Brotherhood's opening up, and they have these shirts that say F racism, no tolerance for ignorance, right? So that's their shirts, and they're all bold about this. So we travel up with them to Orlando, and Orlando had a Nazi skinhead problem, big time. This is 1988, okay? So we show up and they're all wearing matching shirts with the rebel flag crossed with the American flag, and they're marching to the show. And it's at the Beecham Theater. And the Beecham Theater really did remind me of the Cameo. It was one of those converted movie theaters. And evidently, all the Orlando skinheads were going to fight all the Tampa skinheads were coming in for the show. Okay, so this was a Nazi skinhead convention. All right. And I'm sitting there just walking around the crowd, and you see these huge dudes. Like, I'm 6'4", okay? I'm 220. These dudes must have been 6'4", 250, bulk, muscle. These were old time Nazi skinheads, huge, like Iron Eagles on their backs, swastikas, like full blown. What I had never seen anything like this in my life. It was up close and personal. So I forget the band that was opening up, and it'll probably come to me like tomorrow night. I'll be in bed like that's who it was. But so the first band opens up, and they circle dance out there. Okay, that was something they didn't do in South Florida. South Florida was just basically just waves of people just running into each other. It was total chaos. It was fun, but it was chaos. They circle dance up there, and I watched this dude push the skinhead down and kick him to sleep. Okay, so his friends pull him out, and he's in the lobby, and paramedics are checking him out, and all his friends are around, like, okay, let's go get them. So this huge fight breaks out on the floor, on the dance floor. It's all Nazi skinheads versus Nazi skinheads. Okay. Thankfully, I'm with the band, so I hop up on stage. So I'm watching this with Tim Price, Ivan from Powerhouse is there. I think Evan from Foix. All the guys from Brotherhood are out there, you know. And we're watching this violence, and the cops come storming in, and we didn't have cell phones back there or anything because I would have loved to have caught this. The cops kick all these white power skinheads out, and they all march out zig heiling in uniform, in just in uniform. And it's one of those moments I really would have wish I would have caught on camera. So after that, the show was great. Ron from Brotherhood came out and said, he might not have been able to come out on stage. They did not put out their merchandise until after that incident happened. Okay. So, and needless to say, the accused and SNFU were just over the top, crazy, amazing. It was just a lot of fun. It was just a lot of fun. Another time, the first time I saw Fugazi was also in Orlando, and um, it was really tense. And I got to speak to Ian McKay about this incident in detail. And this is the way I experienced it. I'm on the floor. A lot of us came up from Miami to see the show, and we understood that Miami really there's a lot of animosity in the different scenes around the state. Okay. And it wasn't really on the bands were cool. It was the crowds, right? So you had all these Nazi skinheads up in Orlando, and they weren't all skinheads. They looked regular, like regular dudes. So Fugazi starts, and you can feel like a real big tension in the air. And Ian McKay starts working this tension, right? So they're a couple of songs in, and there's a little bit of scuffle breaks out and so forth, and Ian stops the show and starts lecturing the crowd about, hey, we're not going to have this. And he gets behind the mic. He's like, hey, so a lot of people said that Orlando was tough, and everyone's like, yeah. He's like, yeah. And he said, people last night were saying that maybe we shouldn't even play Orlando. They had played Gainesville the night before. Maybe we shouldn't even play Orlando. And suddenly everyone starts zig heiling. Like, there must have been 1,000 kids zig heiling Ian McKay. And he's like, oh, okay, so you guys are into that too, huh? And he's like, let's leave our politics at the door and just have fun. Song number one, which is off the EP. And just such an amazing show. Just such an amazing show. But talking to Ian, he remembers that very vividly. And you know what? I don't know how other artists would have handled that. You know what I mean? Like I know when the Exploited came through into the US on one of their tours around, I want to say it was like 87, 88. They were into a lot of violence in their tours. And I think that in New York, they had violence with Nazi skinheads up in New York. And they actually had to cancel the rest of their US tour because of that, or reschedule it, postpone it, like, 6 months later. So it was a really strange time, but the way Ian McKay just did that was just amazing. You know, um,
Were you
you asked me
catching?
earlier. Oh, I'm
Sorry,
sorry. What were you gonna say?
were you catching any shows too in the Tampa area? And maybe did you notice any of that same violence that was going on in Orlando?
It's weird because, like I said, I remember this one kid. I don't know his name, but he had long hair and he'd wear an Instead shirt. And what was the back of the Instead shirt? It said, just about just being friends together, just it was, the Instead
Right,
message, right?
right, right.
So, um, we went to see Judge in Tampa. Now, when I say we, I'm talking about the scene as a whole. I wasn't there, but we showed up very strong. There's a lot of us there, and they were there, and you can kind of see the tension. And it was like two sides of the street, right? And they knew who we were, we knew who they were, but nothing really went down, you know? Um, saw, well, I traveled up with Quicksand to see Quicksand at the Paint House. Saw a few bands. When Shelter first came through, when Vic was playing guitar with Shelter, they brought Jose from Beyond Reason because Jose was into the Krishna thing, and Jose was an amazing guitarist. Um, he would go on to become the guitarist with Machine. Eventually, Beyond Reason would become Machine. He was young; he was like 14 or 15, but no, he was older than that. He had to be 16 or 17. He was always like little, right? So he goes on tour with them, playing second guitar, and it was just absolutely amazing. This is later on. This is now I'm doing shows at at Washington Square. So, and like I said, I know I'm all over the place with this, but I went to go see Shelter when Jose played with them in Orlando. Oh, I'm sorry, in Tampa. But this is into the 90s. The white power thing in Orlando and Tampa was starting to phase out into the 90s because it was older dudes and it was the older skinheads that were into it. All the newer kids were more into the hardcore. And like I said, you know what? When Slayer came through and they brought Biohazard with them and they played West Palm, there was white power skinheads in that crowd. And that's something that Slayer is going to draw, right? The metal kids that shave their heads. You know, West Palm Beach had a white power problem in the late 80s, early 90s, and I know the Believers, they had to deal with that up close and personal, you know. Um, like I said, it was really it was different. You had to really carry yourself correct when you went to these different scenes. Melbourne was always cool. I mentioned earlier when went to go see Judge in Tampa. I didn't do the Tampa show, but afterwards they played Melbourne. And then I realized that we were the problem, you know, because the violence that we had in South Florida, we brought to a scene like Melbourne, and there was nothing there to keep it in check the way it was in Tampa with the white power skinheads.
I also want to talk because during this period, right,
Yeah.
a lot of the racism that you've been talking about, and some of these memories of some of the bands that were bringing some of those people to the shows. Your moniker that you were either given or you came up with, Rabbi,
Oh, yeah.
that obviously may not fly with every person who might be coming to a show like that. So talk about
Yeah.
the origins of that moniker. Where does it come from?
It was just a skate thing, you know. I was a skater, I had a mohawk, and my friend Wesley, you know, he was Chinese and we started calling him Tokyo. Well, Tokyo's in Japan, like whatever. So he's like, he started calling me Rabbi, right? And then, you know, we used to skate over at the Island Ramp. It was Jamie's Ramp, was a half pipe behind Island Water Sports in North Miami Beach. Well, you had other kids from, you know, that's where I met Ivan from Powerhouse, but this is before he was in Powerhouse, and all the South Beach kids, you know, South Beach Jeff and all these friends. And then you had the Hialeah kids like Donnie, Cuban Donnie and Eric. And now we're all skating together. And Wesley and my friend Dan, they started introducing me as Rabbi, and they loved it. Now I start going to shows, and you know, what was beautiful about back then, and you could write your own narrative. You could be whoever you wanted to be. You could be a supermodel from outer space if you wanted to be, right? Because it was basically the story you told. You were writing your own narrative. So Rabbi was everything that Larry wasn't. Larry's my real name, or Lawrence. You know, Larry was the kid in high school that didn't have a lot of friends, you know, who was shy and insecure. And then by the time I hit high school, I get into hardcore summer of 85. I start going to shows the second half of 85, or I'm sorry, second half of 15, summer of 86. I just turned 16. I start going to shows. So, you know, I'm starting to get into this, and I'm probably in 10th grade at this time. I go away for the summer. Not away, but I just don't go to high school, right? By the time I hit my junior year in high school, everyone knows who Rabbi is. And now I become a senior, and people are lying about hanging out with me, right? And Rabbi became the guy who was on guest lists everywhere, backstage everywhere, knew everyone, but more importantly, they knew who I was. And Rabbi became his own identity. Rabbi was the dope smoking, cool guy that just loved everyone. I have a lot of great friends to this day. And you know, it's funny, even when I came in here over at Love Hate, you know, I saw Jose, and he's like, "Hey Rabbi, what's up, man?" To this day, they still call me Rabbi. And it's such a small group of people. But you know what? In the scene, like I saw Walter with Grill Biscuits, and that's probably the first time I've seen Walter Sugar since the mid 90s, maybe 93, 94. And he called me Rabbi. And I saw Charlie, and he called me Rabbi. And when I introduced myself to Civarelli, and I hadn't seen Civ in a long time, as they said, hey, it's Rabbi, you know. So there are people that know me as Rabbi. And I'm not someone that's at war with the past, you know. It's something I've embraced. It's cool. I think that, you know, when I think about how normal my life is today versus, hey, Green Day stayed at my house one tour. That seems like a million lifetimes away, you know. But back then, when I look in the mirror, I only saw Rabbi. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see Lawrence, you know. Um, when I think of Rabbi, I almost think of him as a separate person because it is so far in the back, you know, in the past, and it's so much not who the person I am today. But it's like I said, it's something I embrace. It's something that's a part of me, and to a lot of people, that's who I am still to this day. I understood the being rabbi. Being rabbi taught me how to do marketing because so much of what I did centered around who I was, right? And that could be a good thing, and that could be a bad thing because oh yeah, that's Rabbi. He's a party guy, and he smokes the most weed and does the most, you know. That could hurt you because you start trying to live up to this reputation, that is not true to who you really are. I think that when I mentioned earlier when I was younger, I had a mohawk, and I would always stand up the mohawk every time I went to shows. It was a California mohawk; it wasn't a full blade. And Susie and the Banshees was probably the last time I stood my mohawk up. And I think that as you evolve into the scene, and really back then in the mid 80s in the scene, it was more of a scene in the sense that you had to be seen, SEEN. So everyone dressed up for shows. Everyone, if you had a mohawk, you put your mohawk up. And you know what I'm saying? Everyone did it. Everyone dressed up the leather jackets, the boots, you know what I'm saying? Um, that's another thing I think I mentioned, like when Youth Today came through. Not only did the scene change the way we danced and the way we looked at listen to music, but our style of dress changed. And we started getting away from the boots and braces and the combat boots and the skank kid look, and it evolved more into a New York hardcore look, right? So I I realized early on that I didn't need to put my hair up or wear my hair any certain way because the hairstyle wasn't who I was. I was going to be rabbi regardless. And I've had Krishnas, I've had the brain handle, I've had obviously shaved heads, dreadlocks. But interestingly enough, towards the latter part, I wanted to bring the glam back to the scene. So I'd start going out wearing the fur coats and the spike collars and the black nails and the lip ring and it was fun. It was fun because I said earlier, you got to write your own narrative. You got to create your own backstory. And when I started going to shows, I was 16, living at home. It was great. 18, I'm out. I'm out of my house, right? The whole time I'm doing shows, I'm living in a six-bedroom house on in downtown Miami. And Ron Sass from Gus and Pontius Pilate lived there. Eric B from Pontius Pilate lived there. Um, Addison lived there from Quit. Brian Elliott lived there. It was all the bands that I brought down would stay there. MU330 stayed there. Into Another stayed there. Like I said, so many of our friends would stay there. And you get to that place in life where you have to determine what you're going to do with your life. And you got to pay bills, so you got to work, and it's not so carefree anymore. And it would be great if we could all be 17 forever, but that doesn't work.
No, it does
You
not
know,
work.
it really doesn't work.
No.
And the unfortunate thing is like when you're hanging out in that moment, you think it's going to last forever. You know, I mentioned earlier I saw Gorilla Biscuits back in November. They came through, and I got to be 17 again. And a lot of friends from back then got to be 17 again. But what struck me was a lot of them were still 17, even though they're in their 50s. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And if you're not making money being 17, then at some point you got to let it go and you got to grow because, when I got into the scene was limitless. There was such a huge ceiling. You didn't see the end. And then after being there, I I I left when I was 25. Not really officially, but that's when I fade out. I start phasing out. And like I said, I had the experience with God. I decided, okay, am I gonna continue doing shows, or am I gonna what's the next step? Where do I go from here? Because I was hitting the ceiling. And at 25 in the scene, I don't want to say things ran its course, but you know, we all grew up with a loser Rob or a Johnny Sponge or people that were older that ended up passing the exit and just staying around a little too long. And we could talk about, Bobby Lode. And I love Bobby, but he drank himself to death because obviously he had a drinking problem. He probably had some other problems as well. But one of the things that struck me was when Lode broke up, Bobby wasn't ready for them to break up. And even though Fausto was able to do stuff and Jeff Tucci was able to do stuff after, and so was Tony, Bobby couldn't. You know what I mean? Bobby wasn't ready for that party to end. And the truth of the matter is the party ends somewhere. And it's best to be the first to go than the last to go. Because the last to go, suddenly you become, oh, loser Rob or hurting
Right.
Rob or you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I want
And
to ask you real quick though too,
yeah,
Rabbi, because Load is one of those bands that would play church shows a lot. So
oh yeah,
that's one place we have not talked about yet, but I know you also had a hand at booking shows at Churchill. So what are your memories of both seeing shows and booking shows for Churchill's?
Churchill's, Churchill's was not my first venue or even my second venue. Like I said, I did the Thrashcan, TOSL. I brought down Violence. I brought Sepultura down on their first tour, first U.S. tour. Their second date, they played Tampa, then they played the Thrashcan, and it was Obituary Sadist and Cynic. Just an amazing show from start to finish. Um, then once the Thrashcan closed, I started doing shows at Washington Square. Now, Washington Square was a great, great venue. It was actually designed for live shows. It was just a bar. It was just a bar, but it was like a 300 person capacity. 500 was pushing it. Okay. And that is where I did a majority of my shows. Okay. So I brought the Boss Tones down to the square. I brought Green Day to the square, Into Another and Shift to the square. Rancid I brought to the square. I brought, um, who else? Shelter 108. I did a Henry Rollins spoken word at the square. I got to pick up Henry Rollins from the airport with Tim. And, it's funny because he, they were doing the Lollapalooza tour. They just played Orlando and they had a day off. So I reached out to their agent and brought Henry Rollins down for a spoken word. So the agent asked us, hey, if you guys could pick him up from the airport, that would be great. This is pre 9/11. So you were able to walk right up to the gate. So we see Rollins coming out. He just has a duffel bag and that's it. It's, and it's like, this is Henry Rollins. Okay. This is like, wow, this is like punk rock icon. And he treated us like he was shocked to see us. Evidently, the agent didn't tell him someone was picking him up. He arranged for someone to pick him up. But we walked around with him and it was cool. It was cool, but it was like strangers treating a stranger. You know, this is 91. This is right after Joe Cole had been shot. And so much that I know about Rollins now. Because, listen, we didn't really have the internet back then. There was no YouTube, there was no Facebook, there was none of that. So you didn't really know the entire history of someone before meeting them. And like I said, there were some really deep things I really wish I would have known about Rollins because, like I said, this is someone that was a real huge influence on my life as a kid coming up. So, um, Rollins taught me how to count money. That was pretty cool. Backstage at the square, he taught me how to count money, and I still use that to this day. But there was just a whole lot of cash. I think the other time I mentioned I brought Fugazi down, and their entire set was spent counting money, counting singles and $5 upstairs in the Cameo. It was yeah, I missed their set.
Were you able to I know a little while back you were talking about the connections with other people as bands were making their way down, right?
Right.
Gainesville, Orlando. Were you able to bring a lot of those bands down from those same connections, or were you already established at this point to where you could basically reach out to a band or a
Right.
member of a band and say, "Hey, I want to book you at Washington Square or at Churchill's." Like, were you or were you able to have those connections at
Well,
that point?
I think it was a combination of things. I think that during the square, like for instance, Fugazi was probably the exception to this rule because I flew up to Boston to hang out with a good friend of mine, and I mentioned him earlier, Dan, and it was Fugazi was playing the Channel on St. Patrick's Day in Boston, a 3 o'clock matinee, and Eye for an Eye opened up in 7 League Boots, but I knew the promoters up there, and we had a good connection. So I ended up talking to Ian and Guy about coming down. And Ian handles his own booking. So that's how I got them to come down to play the Cameo. And that was my biggest show. I mean, 1,300 people showed up, at least 1,300 paid. There's probably about 1,500 there. Um, the Believers opened up. There's a really great picture of the Believers. I'm in the background of that picture, and it's one of my favorites. It's Chad is at the forefront, and I think Tony and Dane have fallen down, and it was just it was just a lot of fun.
Did
But
you did you have
I'm
your
sorry.
pick? Did you have your pick as to which local band you wanted to play that show? Like, how did it wind up being the
Oh yeah,
Believers?
yeah, no, because I asked the Believers, and Funkhauser opened up. Funkhauser was Dennis, who eventually played with Machine. So yeah, it's for me, Funkhauser, they had a big guitar sound, so it actually worked really well in that venue. The Believers sounded better in smaller venues because they were more up close with the crowd. Um, the stage was really high at this point at the Cameo. It's interesting because every time Rollins come through, the stage would get higher because that was a Rollins thing. So the stage eventually got higher. Like when I saw 7 Seconds the first time at the Cameo, like the stage might have been just past my knee, the top of the stage. By the time Fugazi came through, the stage was, I'm 6'4", it's probably about 7 feet, and a barrier in front of it. So, but getting back to the original question, I worked a lot with Margie from Leave Home. There were different agents around the country, and you know, at this point, Quicksand was working with Lisa Miller. Lisa Miller was working with Bob Slade at this time because at this point now it's really Bob and I doing shows. And this is kind of how stupid things were. We, I don't want to use the word competitors because I never viewed it like that. But Bob surely did. Like once Bob called me a grifter. I was like, grifter? I got to look that word up, you know? And listen, I grew up with Fausto and Tony and Jeff and Bobby, of course. I remember when Bobby and Jeff were doing Insanity Assassin over at the Junkyard. You know what I'm saying? So, and now he's managing them, and these are my boys, and he doesn't like me, not because I did anything wrong to him or, like did anything ugly with him, just because I did shows, you know? And I don't think he understood, and maybe I didn't understand it either back then, that it was part of scene building, building up the scene. And you got to keep a balance out there. You don't want just one promoter because you miss out on a lot of great bands because of the relationships. Like I had stronger relationships with Margie, and that's Into Another, that Shift, that was Sensefield, that was SNFU and the Bouncing Souls. Like she also did oh, what was that band? Offspring. She did a lot of these. I didn't have a chance to bring down Offspring, but you know what I'm saying? Your relationships with different promoters got to really expose the scene. I'm not sure how I brought Green Day down. I'm not sure. I know it wasn't through Margie, but I worked with different people. There's a guy, Peter Davis. He was out of the Minnesota area. He did the Melvins. He did Helmet. He did Nirvana. I had Nirvana booked tentatively. Their guarantee was $200. This was Bleach. This was not Nevermind, right? Um, I brought the Melvins down to Washington Square. That was a great show, but only 60 people showed up. When I brought Green Day through, they were still touring in a van. I think Rancid, when I brought Rancid down, how do I say this? Green Day was the bigger band, but the size that Green Day was when I brought them down versus the size that Rancid was when I brought them down. Rancid was much more popular at that point. Um, I wasn't really a big fan of Rancid. I didn't really connect with them. A lot of the bands I did connect with, Rancid is one of those bands I didn't connect with.
Did you feel that was a critical component for you bringing a band down, or did it not matter as much because you knew a band could draw a crowd?
I never did it. I never did it for money. I mean, Boss Tones like Dickie, like I really like those dudes. Like all the Boston bands, Eye for an Eye, Maelstrom, Sam Blackchurch. You know, for me, I was a fan first, so it wasn't a financial thing for me because I couldn't play in the big leagues. Doing the arena bands, right? And you start getting into mid '90s, you got Danzig opening up for Black Sabbath at the Sunrise Musical Theater. Okay, you got Red Hot Chili Peppers playing. Mother's Milk came out, and suddenly Red Hot is playing at Club 1235, which became Decos, and you're talking about maybe 2,500 people. They were probably south of 2,000, but still, you know what I mean? You had Bayfront, Jane's Addiction, and the Beastie Boys, and Henry Rollins, and suddenly these bands just became just huge. So I couldn't really compete with that, nor did I want to. I mean, for these smaller bands like Mean Season and Unbroken, I got to bring them down to Churchill's. And like I said, I was a fan first. So it was fun to see them. Like I brought SNFU and the Bouncing Souls to Churchill's. I brought 108 through with Bloodlet opening up. And to me, I look at like that show right there as a show I would have wanted to see. You know? So for me, it wasn't about, oh, I'm going to bring down this band, I'm going to make all this money. That was never, ever, ever anything I even considered. I'm glad you asked that question because I never really even thought of it until you asked that. You know what I mean? I know that there was a faction of gutter punks in the scene, and I think they thought that I was some sort of corporate, you know, bad guy. I was the man and all this stuff. And oh, punks for profit. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think I made money when I brought Fugazi down. I made money when I bought the Boss Tones down. Most of the time I broke even. I didn't really have any money to lose. I did have an incident with Born Against and Rorschach. Um, yeah, let me unpack this really quick because this is something that it was, in my opinion, it was a misunderstanding and it was something that really got blown out of proportion by some factions, and it's something I had to deal with on a personal level throughout. So Born Against and Rorschach come through, and gutter punk out of New York. So, and at this time, I'm not living at home, and I'm living on Tim Price's couch in his parents' house. Okay, and um, so I call them, I bring them down. I'm working with either Adam or Sam, and they tell me their guarantee is $125. Okay, so Bob Goldie's band opens up, Hangman, local band, and and about 100 people show up. It's a $5 ticket. The square took $2 off the top, and that was a great deal. They would get $2. So if it was a $7 door, they got $2. And I always tried to keep my tickets under $10 wherever I was. I think the most expensive show I ever did was when I brought Sick of It All down um, to the Kitchen Club in Coconut Grove. But with um, with Born Against and Rorschach, after the show, they asked me for some more money. I gave them the 125, and I gave them an extra $25, so it was 150. I gave um, I gave Bob Goldie's band $50, and I kept about $100, right? They didn't say anything to me at that point, but then they went around telling people that I ripped them off, that I was supposed to pay them $125 each, and that I didn't, and it was $250, and I ripped them off. And hand to heart, I'm going to tell you, if they would have told me it was $125 each, I would have addressed it if it was $125 each. Okay? They didn't say that. It was $125 for both bands. Okay? That was my understanding of it. My understanding was I gave them more money than they asked for. I don't know how they think they could have asked for, and listen, this is early 90s, okay? This isn't $125 each. That's kind of low right now, right? But for the time, for a band that was drawing 15 to 20 people when they went out and played, okay, they weren't getting a $250 guarantee off of 15 and 20 people. All right. They were touring off a 7-inch. Now, I would see Chuck Rorschach play. They came through. They played Churchill's a couple of years later, and I approached Chuck and I pulled him aside and I explained to him my perception of the situation. And he flipped out on me. He was yelling at me and he didn't really handle himself correctly. Because listen, we're not talking about life-changing money. All right? We're not talking about life-changing money. There are a couple of bands I did wrong. Um, Damnation AD, Wall-Eyed, and I don't want to say it wasn't my fault. I was getting under pressure by the venue on that one. If I ever see Ken Ogden from Damnation, I'm pulling out my wallet on spot and dropping him a few bills because that was a situation that was beyond my control, and I really feel like I ripped those guys off. It was the wrong venue. I should have did them at Churchill's. I did them at the church. They really dealt me wrong at the church. It was really hard to deal with those cats at I'm sorry, the Kitchen Club. It was the Kitchen Club in Coconut Grove. So Ken, if you ever hear this, if you see me, I got you. All right. I don't know the guys at Wall-Eyed. If you see me, call me out. I'll take care of you. Head First, a band out of Los Angeles. I gave them $100. I should have gave them a little bit more. They were on a bill with Eye for an Eye, Sam Black Church, and Maelstrom. And those three Boston dudes, they pressed me really hard for extra cash. And I wasn't bold enough, or I didn't have the courage enough to say no to them. So with those dudes, I didn't even think I gave them $100. I think I might have gave them $75, and I gave those other three bands 325 total because I wanted to give everyone $100 pop each. And so yeah, the guys from Head First, I owe some money to. But the guys from Born Against and Rorschach, no, I don't. I don't feel like I do. And but listen, this is all under the bridge, and like I said, it's not life-changing money. But when I brought down Rancid, they brought it up. When I brought down 411, they brought like Dan O'Mahony, he brought it up. Avail, those guys brought it up. And I have a lot of respect for Tim Barry because he came back to me like there's something we talked about before the show and after the show. He really thanked me and said I dealt them straight. And I really appreciated that because that was always my intention. You know what I'm saying? Because I listen, whether I had a job when I was doing shows or I didn't have a job when I was doing shows. So listen, when I didn't have a job, I was selling weed. You know what I'm saying? So I lived in a six-bedroom house. I had a ton of roommates. I wasn't trying to buy a Maserati. You know what I mean? I wasn't trying to pay off all my bills. This wasn't my main hustle. This was always something I did because I enjoyed doing it. It was my contribution to the scene was doing concerts because I knew this. If I didn't continue doing concerts in Miami, no one would. And I noticed even after I did shows, when I stopped doing shows, I started at the Thrashcan, moved to the Square. From the Square, once the Square closed down, it was to the church. No, it was between Churchill's and the church. I'm sorry, the Kitchen Club in Coconut Grove, and then it ended at Cheers. And Cheers was the very last three or four shows. It was a Veil. It was Into Another and Shift. Oh, and Sensefield. I'm sorry. I love Sensefield. I don't know if you ever got in Sensefield. I love those guys.
I do like Sensefield.
Um, they're just and John Bunch, just such an amazing dude. It hurt me when he passed.
I feel like more of those bands too, kind of like Sensefield, were the bands that were playing Cheers as this shift was
right,
happening.
right, exactly. So, and I think that was the evolution. And I think that there were certain shows like you mentioned earlier about Bob. There were certain shows that Bob would bring down, like he'd bring down Biohazard. Even though Stick of It All were my boys, he ended up bringing them down. I got to bring them down later on. I brought down the Cro-Mags, but this was John Joseph and Mackie, and but like Tom from Smoke Dog, Tom Bowker, he was also doing shows down here, but he would bring down bands like Buzz Oven, and it goes to your relationships with the different agents around the country and who you work with. And Buzz Oven's like a band I would never bring down. I wasn't really into them, but All was playing a really small club over on Miami Beach. It was up on North Beach, okay? And there was this guy Monk who was their roadie, traveled with them. And this is with I think Scott Reynolds was singing, so it's Descendants with Scott Reynolds. So I go up on stage. It's a really small stage. I think it's maybe a knee-high stage. I hop up on stage to go, just run across and jump on the crowd. And he comes up from behind me and pushes me like really hard. He did this to me also. Oh, this is interesting. I used to stage dive a lot at the Cameo. And I up on stage. This is Agent Orange and All. This is the first time All came through. Descendants had just broken up. And I go up on stage, go do a stage dive, and he comes up behind me and pushes me. Okay. And there's a barrier between the stage and the crowd. So at this point, I know most everyone, including security. Security were our boys. Like all these guys lived in my neighborhood. I used to hang out with these guys when they weren't doing shows, so we knew security. We owned the Cameo. I got to be honest with you. We owned South Beach when we were kids. We knew all the clubs, because some of the clubs were just fronts for drugs. So we knew all the DJs, all the bartenders, all the people working the door. So we got in everywhere, whether PIL was playing Club 1235 or Social Distortion, or we never paid for anything, never paid to see. I saw the Pixies at the Cameo, never paid for anything, the Ramones. But, anyways, so this dude Monk pushes me for the second time. Okay. So the first time, I was okay. I could have got hurt, and that kind of sucked for him. But but then he does it in a really small club, and Jesse from Foix grabs him and pulls him into the crowd, and he gets pummeled. Okay, And Bill Stevenson, he's a true veteran. He comes out from behind the drums. He's got his hi-hat stand in his hand. He's ready to like throw down with these guys. Like he's ready to, you know. And I had a good talk with that dude Monk after the show. And I was like, listen, you did this to me before, you did this to me again, and you don't have to do that. I don't know why you're trying to protect the band. I'm not going to run, you know, I'm not going to run and dive into the drum set. Maybe that's been your experience with other folks. I'm not going to do that. And had a really good conversation with Bill Stevenson after that show, talking about, because he did the Black Flag tours, and he talked about in Detroit when someone pulled a gun on Rollins, and um, but you said it earlier about how important it was to make that connection with the bands. You know, to me, I thought that was like one of the really special things about the bands coming through, is being able to connect with these bands like Ray and Porcell, having seen them with Youth of Today and then getting to meet them and develop a friendship with them. They're supposed to come through, I believe next week they're supposed to come through. And I'm going to see Ray and Porcell, and whoever else might be playing with them, like John Joseph to this day, like a few years ago, Sick of It All came through with Murphy's Law, and just being able to see the guys from Sick of It All again and hang out backstage with them and just share stories and find out about Armand's kids and how his kids are like in college now, and just what I'm saying, they're just people, and sure,
Mm.
you're not going to get a chance to connect with everyone. Let me just bring it back to this though. You mentioned Churchill's earlier, and I really did want to get into Churchill's. The thing about Churchill's is it was such a great venue, but it wasn't always all ages. And there were some shows I guess I should have done at Churchill's. This is post Washington Square, but because it wasn't all ages, like a Veil came through before I brought them down, and they were brought down by someone else, and they ended up having to play a warehouse. Actually, they played the Machine Warehouse with Jason's band, and I just think that Churchill's, as the scene got older, it got a little easier to make it 18 and over, and everyone would get in anyways. But Churchill's probably wasn't a place you wanted a 15 or 16-year-old to be at. You know what I'm saying? So, I understand the whole church, the whole all ages thing, but 15 and 16 is really young, especially in the real world. In our world, it wasn't, but in the real world, it was. So I did a local night at Churchill's, and it was every Sunday night, and it was local bands. It was just a focus on local bands. And now we're a few generations in, because my generation coming up was Cynic, Flaw, The Believers, Powerhouse, Awake. These were my friends. Mentioned earlier, Amazing Grace and the Drills and Silent Rage. That was the previous generation. You know, you had a band, Cultural Brain Rot, which CBR, they were amazing, great band. Uh, uh, they were a Kendall band. And so you have now quit. Powerhouse is gone at this point. Beyond Reason would evolve into Machine, which was basically the guys from Beyond Reason, Jason, Mike Maribel, and Jose, with Dennis from Funkhauser. Brian would go on and do with Adele Timescape Zero. And now there's no Powerhouse, quits on a completely different page. Load is still out there, but Load, I've done local shows with Load as well. You know, I've done a few gigs, but because of my relationship or lack thereof with Bob Slade, it was hard for me to really incorporate Load into what I was doing. But he was incorporating Load into what he was doing, which actually worked. Um, I got some thoughts on both Bob Slade and Ralph Caballero. Bob was the manager for Load. Ralph Caballero, Graveyard Ralph, he was the manager for Quit. Like I said, I don't know if Bob likes me or not. I don't really care at this point. But from a very professional standpoint, I think that Bob did a much better job with a lesser band than Ralph did with Quit. I think that, and the reason why I say it, and it's not me comparing the two bands like that. I just think that style-wise, Quit was much more ear candy. They were more like Green Day and Jawbreaker. And for that time, that's a band that should have been at that level, right? Whereas Load was definitely more hardcore, more sluggish, more of the Melvins, more sad, Steel Pulp. They were more of that grungy, hard, but not Nirvana, catchy, right? I thought Bobby was a great frontman. I think that musically, both bands are great. Um, but if if Bob Slade would have had Quit would have been much bigger, and they really should have been. And sometimes you hit that wall, and I think maybe that wall is kind of what caused them to really just, okay, time to grow up, right? Go
Yeah.
in different directions.
Was there any
But
reason why perhaps you didn't make that transition to maybe getting into management for bands?
well, you know what? I kind of kicked it around a little with Funkhauser and with the Believers. Thus, that's why they opened up for Fugazi. Um, you know what? I knew that I couldn't do for them what others could have done. Like, when Instead came through, I had the Believers open up. When the Boston's came through, I had Funkhauser open up. You know, so to me, I was able to do that at that level, but that was all I could do. You know,
Why do you say
because
that?
so well, it's also this too. I just think that the band is built on the individuals. I think that Load was more committed to touring. Funkhauser never would have toured. Those kids, they were just a bunch of local kids, and that's all they were going to be. The Believers, I don't know if they would have toured either, to be honest with you. And this is me looking back now because I never really thought about it and unpacked it until just now. Whereas, Quit toured. Now how long could they stay on a tour playing small venues and not really getting national exposure? Load was actually getting national exposure, but that band was so self-destructive that there was no way they could have continued on past their due date. You know what I mean? So both those bands broke up for much different reasons. I think Powerhouse could have taken it to the national level, but once again, I don't know. You had Dan from Cavity, so Dan could have toured and Dan would have toured. Um, but that that version of Powerhouse where it was Ivan and Tim, it was I believe Andy, Scott, and Andy Powell, Scott Baldwin, and Danny. Now, Danny did Cavity. Cavity's amazing. You know, that like Danny grew into that role. Okay. The last incarnation of Powerhouse never would have toured. Jason, Andy Powell probably would have. I don't think Tim and Ivan could have, you know, like Machine. Machine played the Milwaukee Metal Fest with integrity, but that was their pinnacle. Once again, they hated each other towards the end. Okay. Jose, the guitarist, great musician, he had already checked out. Okay. Mike Maribel was not serious enough. Dennis and Mike were drinking too much. Jason was an absolute crazy person at that point. Okay, he had been doing this way too long. He was an absolute crazy person, and it was just too much tension in the band. Now you take them, you stick them in a van for 6 weeks. Okay, they would have killed each other. So Jason's gone on and toured. He's toured with the Weapon. He's actually toured with he's toured with Cavity. He's toured with AAA. He's done some touring. Um, it's hard. You know, I went on the road once with the Ed Matu Struggle, and it was Juan Montoya, Scott. I think Juan Montoya is the only one really in that band that really did anything beyond that band. But I did 6 weeks. No, I did 4 weeks with them, and it was rough. It's like having a bunch of girlfriends in a van. And it's like, okay, look, this is my space. If you need something over there, you ask me, I'll reach it. And hated each other. We got somewhere, we would just take off, right? I'd hang out with Kyle from Swivel Stick. I'd hang out with Kyle. Kyle was great. And the first part of that tour, we had Floor with us, which was Steve Westbrook's band. And Steve and Juan would eventually go on to do Torch. But now we have a van, we have a trailer, so all the equipment's there. But now there's 8 of us in the van, and the only escape you got is if you got to drive, right? So you had that. Um, and then once they left the tour, now we're all stuck in the van with the equipment. It was rough, man. It was rough, and there was no way getting away, and you're stuck with these people. You wake up with them, they're there. You go to sleep with them, you're there.
Right.
You know, they're there. So I think that's what you need, that chemistry to take to the next
Sure.
level.
You
You know,
definitely
so
do. I know
but
when you
I'm sorry.
I I know when you said this word tension, it wasn't because you were referring to the band Tension, but they were also around
I
this
like
time
them. Yeah,
too, but they have not come up yet in our conversation. So
we're going to
did
talk about them right now.
did you get a chance to see Tension play or perhaps
Yes,
put on one of their
of course.
shows?
It was the Sunday nights, and what it did was it opened up an entire, like, all these Coral Springs bands. Okay, so Shai Hulud. It's funny. I was already at scene by Newfound Glory by the time Newfound Glory came around, but I love Chad. And Chad was part of that scene, that Coral Springs scene. You had Ray with Grass Patch, Ray Sousa. Um, shoot, who else? Mike Hurley from Tension. They were a lot of fun. Actually, I booked a tour with Tension and Timescape Zero in Florida, and it was Tampa. It was Did we play that? We played We played Tallahassee. We played Gainesville, and then Melbourne. It was like 4 dates, 4 dates, and it was a lot of fun. Different personalities to manage, right? Like, one of the things I do now professionally is I manage personalities. So I was managing personalities back then too. And in Tallahassee, we played this. It used to be a hospital during the Civil War time. It was turned into a frat house. So that was interesting. We played Matt Sweeney's house in Gainesville. Matt's with No Idea. He was a Miami guy. He played in that band. Tired from now on,
Oh,
or
try
End
from
of the
now on.
Century Party. He also did End of the Century Party. But Gainesville had like so many great bands. Don's ex-girlfriend, Radon. Radon's one of my favorite bands in the state. Bloodlet's one of my favorite bands in the state. But once again, it becomes generational. So we leave the quit powerhouse generation. Now we're in the Timescape Zero machine generation of bands, which Bloodlet's a part of. Radon's a part of that. Radon was actually a part of the quit generation, but they kind of, before it's Chocolate Grasshopper, they broke up, and then Radon got started and so forth. Um, there were so many great, great, great Florida bands,
Yeah.
and for a lot of these bands like Tension and Grass Patch, it was, oh, what was Mitzi's band? It was a ska band, Jive Step Bunch. It's like it was Rich and Mitzi, and once again, it's now you got this generation of bands, and this is their first in the first version, for a lot of these, this is the first band they were playing with. Ray would go on to play with Load right at the very end. And it's interesting talking to him about how dysfunctional Load became towards the end because of the drugs. And, once again, we were all very self-destructive. You know what I mean? We were all seeking self-destruction. It was rough getting through that time, you know, that time in life. I don't know if it was a South Florida thing. I don't know if it was a just a hardcore thing. I do know this though, that it was a time that will never happen again. Because like I mentioned all the violence that we grew up with, and thankfully when I went to go see Gorilla Biscuits, or even when I saw Sick of It All and Murphy's Law, or even Judge when Judge came through a few years back, there was no violence, no fights at least. And to me, it's a good thing. It really is. It really is. I was going to say I had some mixed feelings about that, but the scary aspect of it is completely gone. But it's also this too, the memories we created, the lives that were touched and changed, you know. Um, but getting back to bands, Brethren was a great band out of Hialeah, and a lot of these bands actually put out some 7 inches, were able to do some stuff. Mindframe was awesome, but I think that the band has to be wired a certain way, and timing is definitely a timing is very essential for a band, especially to become at that next level,
Right.
to be able to move on, because it's hard keeping it together. If you're living at home, it's really easy. You become an adult now, things like making money and paying your bills becomes a problem, like how many great NBA players never made it to the NBA because they had a kid when they were in college, and suddenly that NBA dream and playing overseas became so impractical you couldn't do it, you know and I think that happened, and I think that still happens to a lot of aspiring musicians. It's just
Yeah.
a, adulthood
Sure.
kicks in,
Of course.
you know
Well, it's good that you took the time to share your memories and what it was like through your lens. And I share this with a lot of guests. Your experience was not everyone else's experience, even though you may have lived through the same years together. So it's really important to capture that in this episode. So thank you so much, Rabbi, for
Thank you.
coming on the
Yeah.
podcast. And I think we've answered the question, what happened to Rabbi?
I think so. I mean, it's I'm still alive, which is considering some of our friends who can't quite say that. Yeah, no, listen, I'm in a really good place. I think that after the scene, I mentioned earlier, I started going to church in 85. I'm sorry, 95. Got filled with the Holy Ghost, started living for God. Um, just kind of grew up. I really took on, sometimes life takes you in a lot of different directions. And I travel so much right now. I probably travel more than I've ever traveled before. I'm in a good place. I'm in a good place in so many different ways. And I'm not at war with my past. Some people are. I'm not. I've embraced every aspect of it because I realize this, that you don't get do-overs. You can't go back and um, there's some things you just can't change. You can't go back and change the past. You could apologize for things you've done wrong. You could try to make things right moving forward. But I think as you get older, that margin of error gets smaller and smaller. So I'm in a good place. I'm really careful about the things I do now, more so than when I was a kid. Because, as a kid, we saw self-destruction. As an adult, you end up sacrificing. You used to sacrifice the present, no, the future for the present, right? You want to take care of self. Now I've learned how to sacrifice the present for the future. And I'm not sure how much future I have, but regardless, I'm going to make sure I don't show any regrets in my life, and really enjoy life and just, just make the most of it. Like I said, life is too short. I promise you, I ain't crossways with nobody. I ain't got, I was thinking about that when we first talked about this. I started thinking about some people, and I'm like, yeah, man, I don't dislike that person. I don't like, I don't have anything bad to say about them. Why? You know, they might have did me wrong at that moment, and I felt it, but you know what? That's like 30 years ago, right? So,
Exactly.
Jeff, yeah, and Jeff, listen, I really appreciate everything you're doing with the Florida Sound Archives.
Thank you.
Whatever you do, you keep on doing it, man. All right, you keep on doing it, and I think that it's really great. It's the one thing that I noticed about our scene coming up. It was never documented. There was no one out there always taking photos, so there's no real photo books out there. The scene that I came up from was pre-social media, right? So there's no video. Like we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have cell cameras. So it was not only rare to have someone with a photo, like a regular camera, much less a video. So much of that stuff is just kind of just lost to the winds of time.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate what you're doing with documenting
Thank
all
you.
this stuff, and anything you need, you hit me up. I'll take care of it. Well, I'll do what I can. All
I
right.
appreciate that, Rabbi. Thanks for being such a fabulous guest.
Like I said earlier, I really appreciate you, Jeff, and really appreciate everything you're doing. And keep up the good work, man.